Today's speaker, Jesse Miller, has worked as a botanist and lichenologist in several regions of North America since 2007. He worked as an environmental consultant earlier in his career and more recently as a researcher. He obtained his bachelor's degree from Evergreen State College in Washington State and his Ph.D. from University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's currently a lecturer at Stanford University, where he teaches ecology and statistics classes. Jesse's research includes the effects of global change factors such as altered fire regimes on lichen and plant communities. Please join me in welcoming Jesse Miller.
Great, thank you very much, Alex, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here, and I'm really happy to get to talk about lichens with all of you, one of my very favorite topics to talk about. So today I'll talk about some research I've been working on over the last few years, trying to understand how global change factors are affecting lichens and what we can do about it. And I'll just start with the basics. Since I know some people here may not have much familiarity with lichens, these are not always the best known organisms. So for anyone who's not familiar, lichens are symbiotic organisms that contain at least one fungal partner and at least one photosynthesizing partner. Historically, we talked about them as if they were a single fungus and a single alga or cyanobacterium. Now we recognize it's not always quite that simple. We're starting to see lichens more as little ecosystems that can contain multiple partners. And lichens are a major component of biodiversity in almost all terrestrial ecosystems. From the wettest rainforests to the driest deserts, you can often find a pretty good diversity of lichens anywhere you go. And they're very diverse in their size and shape and color. These photos are just a few examples. In my opinion, they're really beautiful organisms too. So I've always been intrigued by lichens and have been curious to understand what the lichens are doing and what they're telling us about the world around us. And lichens are ecologically important. In addition to being an important component of biodiversity in their own right, lichens support a lot of other organisms. One example is that lichens provide forage and nesting material for a great diversity of animals. One of my favorite examples is that Bryoria, or hair lichen, which is shown on the photo in the left here, is a food source for flying squirrels in old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest. And flying squirrels in turn are eaten by spotted owls, which are one of our most iconic forest species of conservation concern. I'm sure some people here know the history of the role the spotted owl has played in the development of contemporary forest management policies in the Pacific Northwest. But a lot of people don't realize that lichens are part of the food web that supports the spotted owl. So if the lichens went away, we could expect that would have pretty dramatic effects on the ecosystem. And there are lots of other animals that depend on lichens as well. One particularly charismatic example is that caribou in boreal and polar regions will travel long distances to find good lichens to forage, and will dig them up from under the snow. But it's not just big charismatic animals that depend on lichens. There are a lot of smaller invertebrates that have life cycles that are very interwoven with lichens as well. So to summarize, I would say that lichens are, can be traced back to most other cool and important things in the world. I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but when you put it all together, it is really remarkable how these organisms that are often overlooked are so interconnected with so much else that's going on in the ecosystems around us. And lichens are a large component of biodiversity in many regions, but may have particular importance here in California, where I live. A study by Aaron Tripp and James Lendemer, whose Lendemer is a lichenologist at the New York Botanic Garden, found that California actually has the highest lichen diversity in North America. And this diversity may be centered on the Bay Area where I live. I'm talking to you today from San Francisco. So today I'll be giving you some examples of research I've done here in California, which may be an especially important region for lichen conservation. Despite the fact that this is a global hotspot for lichen diversity and endemism, there's still a lot we don't know about basic biodiversity patterns. For every 100 or perhaps 1,000 people who study plants, there's maybe one person who studies lichens. There are just very few of us working on lichens out there. So there's a lot of work to be done and not very many people doing it. Lichens in California face a number of threats in the era of global change caused by industrial anthropogenic activities. Some of the primary threats include habitat loss, air pollution, altered wildfire regimes, such as the larger, hotter wildfires we're experiencing, and of course, climate change as well. And so today I'll talk about some of these threats in detail, and I'll also try to tell you the positive side of the story as well, because I think there's reason to believe that lichens can have a very bright future. This isn't all doom and gloom, even though there are some serious concerns. And just to give a little bit more background on why California may be at the forefront of some of the challenges we're facing, I want to give one example from a researcher, Dr. Rob Smith, who did his Ph.D. research at Oregon State University and did some analysis of lichen diversity patterns across North America. This is a map of the Forest Inventory and Analysis Study Plots, which is the biggest lichen monitoring program in the country. You can see there are lichen study plots in the majority of the states across the country. Not so many on the Great Plains because there aren't a lot of trees there, and this is a study that focuses on trees. You can see California has relatively high lichen species richness. Those brighter colors mean more lichen species. And Rob looked at which lichen communities might be most vulnerable to climate change based on their what he called thermal bias, which relates to the thermal niche of a species. So how close it is to being outside of the range of climatic conditions where it's historically grown. And so on this map, the black dots are the study plots where the lichens were most vulnerable to climate change. So you can see a lot of these vulnerable communities are in California, disproportionately so compared to the rest of the country. And of course, one reason why we think about lichens being sensitive to climate change is lichens are acutely sensitive to the environment around them. On average, much more so than plants are, for example. And of course, this makes lichens potentially effective environmental indicators because they're responding at such a fine scale and they can respond so rapidly. And one example of this is that lichens can be great indicators of air pollution because they're so sensitive to the environment around them. When we see really well-developed lichen communities of larger, more three-dimensional lichens, like in the photo on the left there, that's usually a sign that we're at a location with relatively good air quality. Because lichens with high surface area like that soak up a lot of pollution and generally can't persist when air pollution is high. In areas with higher air pollution, like areas with a lot of car exhaust, agricultural fertilizers, industrial emissions, we actually see a specialized suite of lichens that can become very abundant. These are much smaller lichens that are typically orange or yellow in color. So this is a tree on the Stanford campus where I work, covered in small yellow lichens that we call nitrophiles. These are nitrogen-loving lichens that are growing there because the amount of bioactive nitrogen, which acts as a fertilizer, is greatly enriched in this urbanized area. And like other organisms, lichens can have differing responses to disturbance. And so that was just one example I showed with air pollution. And so I was curious, can we use these different responses to disturbance to use lichens as a tool for indicating habitats, late successional habitats, and habitat conservation value? So can lichens help us zoom in on the places that might be especially important to conserve on the landscape because they're telling to us so much about what's going on in the surrounding environment? So that's the first question I'll try to address today by talking about some of the research I've been working on. And then I'll go on to address two further questions relating to wildfire. I'll investigate whether larger, hotter wildfires, like we're experiencing here in California these days, may pose a threat to lichen diversity. And then I'll also try to investigate how fast lichens recover after wildfire. All things that have been studied a little bit in the past, but remain pretty poorly understood, in part just because there's so little research on lichens happening. And so I'll present 3 case studies corresponding to these 3 questions I'm asking. I'll start by talking about lichens as indicators of forest stand age and conservation value, and then I'll go on to talk about 2 different studies of lichens and fire history. And I'd like to acknowledge, I have a number of collaborators who've contributed to this work over the last several years. So thanks to all of them for making this possible. I didn't do any of this on my own. So what is habitat conservation value? It's a bit of a nebulous concept. Often we think of habitats with high conservation value as being areas that have experienced less industrial anthropogenic disturbance. And I say industrial because I don't want to give the impression that all human influence is necessarily a negative thing for conservation value. We know that, for example, a lot of the ecosystems we think of as having high conservation value may have been managed fairly intensively and shaped by historical indigenous land management. So I don't want to give the impression that I'm casting all human management as a bad thing, because I think humans can have a positive effect on ecosystems. But we know that intensive industrial activities often do seem to reduce habitat conservation value. We also often recognize that ecosystems with older trees and older plants may be especially important habitats to conserve. Most of us, when we walk into an old growth redwood forest, immediately get the feeling that this is a special habitat that probably has high conservation value. But when we walk into what people sometimes call an old growth grassland or an old growth shrubland, we might not immediately recognize that quite so readily as we do in a redwood forest. So I'm curious whether the lichens can help us identify these habitats in a consistent way. And the concept of late successional habitats relates to the concept of ecological succession, which is how ecological communities change over time, and particularly after disturbance. And in the earlier days of ecology, ecological succession was often seen as a linear trajectory where after disturbance, communities would gradually rebound to what was called a climax state. And this concept of succession being linear and predictable has been called into question more recently and is no longer accepted quite as it was. We now recognize that there's not necessarily a single trajectory that ecosystems follow as they change over time. And I'm talking about how species are replaced by other species. And there's not necessarily a single climax community at a given site. a site could be stable in multiple different vegetation types, depending on perhaps chance events like seed arrival. So while we don't think of ecological succession as being necessarily a single predictable trajectory like we once did, we can still identify particularly late successional habitats on the landscape. And I think most ecologists would agree that these are typically some of the most important habitats to conserve. And so today, I'll present some research I've been doing looking at how lichens can help us identify these late successional habitats. There's quite a bit of evidence that plants can help us identify late successional habitats. And one system that's been developed for exploring this is the concept of floristic quality analysis, and specifically what's called the plant coefficient of conservatism. And the coefficient of conservatism is a number that's assigned to different plant species in a given region based on their affinity for early or late successional habitats. So species that receive low rankings are often called generalist species, and these are species that can occur in many different settings, including settings that have been fairly disturbed by intensive industrial anthropogenic activities. So they might grow in an old field after where it had previously been tilled for crops, and where the mycorrhizal communities have been highly disturbed. At the other end of the spectrum, we have species that receive higher numbers, like in the range of 7 to 10. And these are called specialist species. These are species that don't tolerate industrial anthropogenic disturbance very well, and are more relegated to late successional, or what we might call remnant habitats. And this floristic quality analysis system is used very widely, especially in Eastern North America. I believe every state, or almost every state east of the Rockies, has at least one coefficient of conservatism ranking system. And they're really widely used for land managers. And they can provide really useful information when land managers are inventorying plant communities. And so after seeing how useful the floristic quality analysis system can be, I was curious if we could develop something similar for lichens. And part of the reason I thought this might be possible is because we know that there are certain species of lichens that are almost entirely or entirely restricted to old growth forests. A couple examples are Nephroma occultum on the left here, and Loberia oregana on the right. Nephroma occultum, you basically won't find outside of old growth forests. Loberia oregana does occasionally occur in other settings, but it's a pretty strong indicator of old growth forests. These are both species that you find in the Pacific Northwest down into Northern California. I'm not sure how far south Nephroma occultum goes, actually. And in fact, a number of people have made lists of old growth indicator lichen species, especially in Europe. This idea has been explored before. But there are a few limitations of these previous attempts. And one issue is that these old growth indicator lists have rarely been tested quantitatively or at broad geographical scales. For example, there are studies out there that explore how useful they are, but only within a single watershed, which kind of limits their generalizability. These lists typically use a binary approach where species are assigned as either old growth indicators or not old growth indicators, which may not fully capture all the information that species in the community are giving, since there might be species that are intermediate, right? And instead of just focusing on old growth indicators, I was curious, can we learn something from every single species that's present in a community? Because they all are there for a reason, right? They all should be telling us something. And in addition to there being some species that are strongly associated with old growth forests, we know there are some species that don't seem to be strongly associated with old growth, but also don't immediately appear after disturbance. So we could think of these as intermediate species. This includes lace lichen, which is our California state lichen. and also the tube lichens or hypogymnia species. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, there are also a number of species that are truly early successional species that colonize relatively rapidly after disturbance and are able to tolerate a fair amount of disturbance. And these include our nitrophilic lichens, which are often small yellow and orange lichens. So knowing that we have lichens with all these different affinities for habitat successional state, I worked with some other lichenologists to develop what we called the Lichen Conservation Index. So we took a list of all common epiphytic macrolichens, which means bigger lichens growing on trees in the Pacific Northwest. And we ranked all these species based on our personal field experience of how strongly we thought each of these species would be affiliated with old growth forests. So you can think of this as a wisdom of the crowd approach, where we weren't actually going out and making measurements, but we were using our many years of field experience. I think between the four of us, we had something like 60 years of field experience doing lichen surveys in the Pacific Northwest. So we thought maybe the natural history knowledge we'd gained over that time would be enough to let us make a ranking system that was meaningful. But we didn't stop there. We did want to test it quantitatively and make sure that our rankings really were meaningful. So we, just like in the plant coefficient of conservatism rankings, we ranked all these 225 lichens on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 representing species that are relatively disturbance tolerant, or what we might call early successional species, and 10 being species that are almost completely restricted to late successional habitats like old growth forests. And then to test whether this system is really meaningful in the real world, we use the Forest Inventory and Analysis lichen data set, this large lichen survey that I mentioned earlier, that includes study plots across a range of stand ages, from very young forest stands to very old forest stands. The oldest ones were something like 400 years old, I think, or maybe older. And so we looked for a relationship between the rankings that we had assigned the lichens and the age of forest stands on the ground. And so first of all, we just, using a species level approach, we compared the rankings that we'd given the lichens with the average stand age where they occurred. And so you can see there's a pretty strong positive relationship. Species with low rankings tended to occur in stands that were under 100 years old, and lichens that were ranked 10, which was the highest ranking, tended to occur in stands that were over 200 years old. So there did seem to be something of a relationship. And then the next step we took was we averaged the rankings for all the lichens in a given study plot and compared that to the age, to the stand age of that study plot. And then you can see there's a fairly substantial positive relationship here, although there's a fair amount of noise in the data. But you can see as forest stand age increases, the average lichen conservation index value does increase quite a bit. There were some outliers that had substantially higher conservation index values than we would have expected given the forest stand age. Someday I'd like to go visit some of these plots and see what's going on. I would suspect these may be plots that have experienced management treatments that help them revert to old growth like conditions earlier than we might expect. Going in, for example, and thinning densely planted young stands can help restore some old growth character faster than it would happen in unmanaged stands. We also compared this approach to a binary approach where we just assigned all species to be either old growth indicators or not, which is more similar to what people have done in the past. And you can see this approach does still yield a similar relationship, but it only explains about half as much variation in the data. So we really do lose part of the story when we reduce it to a list of just old growth indicators and not old growth indicators. Having more of a continuous scale does seem to work a little bit better. So to wrap up this part of the story, lichens do seem to be good indicators of old growth forests. And they do seem to represent a spectrum of affinity for old growth forests rather than just being either old growth indicators or not. And also, it was interesting to see that our wisdom of the crowd approach did seem to be useful. Even though we were just ranking these lichens based on our field experience of observing where they grow, that did seem to correlate with stand age on the ground. So I'm going to move on now to talk about wildfire a little bit. You might say it's a hot topic. And this isn't entirely a different world from what I've been talking about, because we see some of the same patterns where lichens may have predictable affinities for being able to respond to disturbance. So we're living in an era when wildfires have become larger and often more severe or intense in many but not all ecosystems. And of course, the changes we're seeing in wildfire vary somewhat between different ecosystems. But here in California, we're seeing a trend towards more frequent fires in some ecosystems and certainly a higher fire severity in many ecosystems. And this is another lichen-related question that hasn't been very well studied in the past. Most studies that have explored lichen responses to fire have had relatively small sample sizes. There has been some evidence that lichens may recover relatively quickly after fire, but in an era when fires are becoming larger and more severe or more frequent, we were curious whether this pattern really holds. Because there's reason to believe that these really large, severe wildfires we're having might damage lichens, which are typically quite vulnerable to fire. Unlike plants, lichens really don't have any adaptations that allow them to survive fire. So first, we asked how long it takes for lichen communities to reestablish after fire. And then I'll talk about research briefly looking at how fire severity affects lichen diversity. So for the first question, I'm going to talk about this one on the left here instead of the one that's circled first. I'll talk about a study of post-fire lichen recolonization in chaparral shrublands in Napa County. And then I'll go on to talk about research I did across several different wildfires in the Sierra Nevada, looking at effects of fire severity on lichens. So first, let's go to the chaparral shrublands of the foothills of the Coast Range in California. This is one of California's most iconic vegetation types, the chaparral shrublands. This ecosystem is often overlooked. Some people may write it off as just brush, but it's actually a really fascinating ecosystem that probably deserves a little bit more attention and credit than we often give it. Chaparral is highly adapted to fire. It's often described as an ignition-limited system, meaning it can burn almost any time. And all that's keeping it from burning is the presence of an ignition source. And when it does burn, it burns very hot. Almost all the shrubs burn to the ground and then resprout. So they have this adaptation that allows them to come back very rapidly after fire. But ecologists are concerned because fire frequency has been increasing dramatically in chaparral shrublands in recent years. And if fire becomes too frequent, the chaparral shrubs may not be able to resprout. Eventually their roots may get exhausted if they have to resprout too many times. And lichens can be really abundant and diverse in chaparral. And we've casually noticed that old chaparral stands seem to have really high lichen diversity. Just at a glance, you know, if you look at this photo, you can see that there are a lot of lichens covering the branches here. And this relates to the concept of old growth chaparral, which is kind of a controversial concept that ecologists have been debating for quite some time in California about whether there really is unique ecological value to chaparral stands that are quite old. Some of these stands can be 100 years old or older if they don't burn for a long time. And ecologists have debated whether there is ecological value to these old chaparral stands and whether they're really anything special. So I'm hoping I can shed some light on that There are also a number of lichens of conservation concern that live in chaparral, which is one reason why it's really important to understand how fire is affecting these communities. So to explore how fast chaparral lichens reestablish after fire, I did a study with some collaborators at the UC Davis Quail Ridge Reserve in Napa County. This is our survey crew. We went out and crawled around in the shrubs to see what lichens were present. And we were very fortunate to have a great range of different fire histories, all within a small area. So we did this study in 2018, and we had a range of fires going back many decades. So some areas had burned 10 or 20 years prior to our study. Other areas had burned 30 or 50 or 60 years before our study. So it really provided a great range of fire histories for us to look at, all within more or less the same ecosystem and environmental conditions. And so this graph shows what we found as far as species richness. So this is time since fire on the x-axis. And then this is the average number of lichens that were present in a study plot on the y-axis. And so you can see that it takes a few decades for the lichen richness to start to level off. Around 20 to 30 years after fire, we start to see the number of lichens leveling off. Which could suggest, okay, as long as we don't have fires more than every 20 or 30 years, then we're fine. Although, unfortunately, in Southern California, we're seeing some of these stands burn as frequently as every 5 to 10 years, suggesting that that may really be reducing the number of lichens on the landscape, especially because chaparral makes up a lot of the landscape in Southern California. But in Northern California, we're not seeing quite that frequent of fires yet. So just to show you what it looked like out there, this is what the chaparral looked like 3 years after fires. You can see the shrubs are resprouting, but they're still pretty small. They're not forming a dense canopy yet. 13 years after fire, the shrubs are getting bigger. It's starting to get a little bit difficult to walk through them, but they're still only about waist to chest high. And it takes several decades for the shrubs to get really big and form this dense canopy. We found that tended to happen somewhere between 30 to 65 years after fire. But it wasn't until the shrubs were even older than that they formed this really dense canopy that was taller than a person. So in these shrub stands that were over 100 years old, we were just walking around in the understory. And interestingly, even though species richness started to return to the unburned condition about 20 to 30 years after fire, we found that there were certain lichens that didn't occur anywhere on the landscape except in stands that hadn't burned for over 100 years. In fact, cyanolichens, which are lichens that have a cyanobacterial partner instead of a green algal partner, the cyanolichens only occurred in areas that hadn't burned for about 100 years or more. And that's a Kalima in the lower left there in the inset, growing on the base of an old shrub. We also had some Fuscopinaria. The cyanolichens are generally considered to be really sensitive species that may need more specific environments than the more common, we call chlorolichens, which have the green algal partners. So even though species richness started to level off after just a few decades, certain groups of species were much slower to return to the landscape. So I think this highlights that there really may be some unique value to old growth, what we call old growth chaparral. Since some species may take many decades to return after fire. And there really were some interesting patterns as far as which groups returned at different speeds. So in conclusion, there does seem to be some real ecological value to old growth chaparral, at least from the perspective of lichens. But what do we actually do about this? It's kind of a challenging situation. Many ecologists would recognize that limiting the frequency of fire in old-growth chaparral can help maintain the biodiversity that exists here. But it is a fire-adapted system. So ironically, having more fire on the landscape surrounding old-growth chaparral patches may actually make it easier to prevent some of these old-growth chaparral patches from burning. We know that suppressing fire has really been a complete failure. We can't just keep fire off the landscape, but we may be able to maintain some of these islands of unburned chaparral, especially if we manage the surrounding landscapes well and reduce the speed of fire spread. Another potential threat is shrub removal to make fuel breaks. Sometimes managers will go in and make really massive fuel breaks in old growth chaparral. And while this may help slow down fire, this can actually be really destructive in itself. And we're actually losing a lot of old growth chaparral to fuel breaks. So there really are some challenges in figuring out how to actually implement this. And now I'm going to briefly wrap up with one last study. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about some work I've been doing in forests in the Sierra Nevada, looking at how fire severity affects lichens. So we'll switch to a different ecosystem now. I'm going to be talking about California mixed conifer forests. These are forests which historically burn mostly at low severity. So prior to European colonization in North America, there were some fires that were started by lightning, but also a lot of fires that were started by indigenous people. And these fires burned through these forest stands very frequently, typically as ground fires. There wasn't a lot of tree mortality or canopy fire. And one shift we're seeing in these ecosystems is a pretty dramatic increase in fire severity, meaning that there's more stand replacing fire or canopy fire than there used to be. And in fact, in some places, we're seeing areas that burn at high severity in really large patches. This is the Angora fire that burned in 2007 in the Tahoe Basin. I took this photo 9 years after the fire. You can see all the trees are dead in an area of about 1,000 acres. There's almost no tree regeneration going on. So this area has become a shrubland. And unless people go in and plant trees, it may not return to a forested state anytime soon. So of course, as a lichenologist, I was curious, what happened to all the lichens that used to be in this forest? Are they just gone? Are they never going to come back? So for this study, with my colleagues, I sampled areas that had burned in 5 different fires. And we were visiting these sites 4 to 16 years after the fires occurred. And at each fire, we sampled areas that had burned across the full gradient of fire severity. So in this fire severity map, the red areas are areas that burned at high severity, and the blue areas are areas that burned at low severity. So we placed study plots across this full fire severity gradient within the fire. And we also established a few plots outside the fire perimeter to try to represent what the lichen community might have been like prior to the fire. And so we established these large circular study plots. And within these plots, we identified all the lichens that were present, both by looking at low-hanging branches and by examining litter fall. We can typically get a pretty good idea of what lichens are present in the forest canopy by seeing what lichens fall on the ground, since they almost all will fall on the ground sooner or later. So this is a beautiful red fir stand in Yosemite National Park that we sampled. And so I'll show you our results from this study. We found that fire severity had a negative effect on lichen species richness, which is not totally surprising since we know that lichens don't burn up when there are fires and don't really have adaptations to survive. So you can see that there were almost no lichens left in our plots that burned at the highest severity, which is where all the trees were killed by fire. But one interesting finding here is that low severity fire had no measurable effect on the lichen community. So the low severity fire is usually ground fire. The ground fire could move through these stands without reducing lichen diversity, probably because most of the lichens are typically in the forest canopy. And we also found that there was a relationship between tree overstory cover and lichen richness. So in areas with very low tree cover or canopy cover, lichen richness was relatively low, but it increased with increasing tree overstory cover only up to a point. Around 40 or 50% cover was where lichen richness maxed out. And this is kind of interesting because historically these forest stands were relatively open stands with maybe 40% tree cover. And it turns out this may actually be the stand density that supports the highest lichen diversity, or at least there's no benefit to increasing tree cover beyond that point. Because of fire suppression, many of these stands didn't burn for many years prior to these most recent fires. So trees had become denser than they had been, which in turn increases fire risk. It turns out the dense forests we see today do not seem to be benefiting the lichens. And then one last result here, this is a structural equation model, which you can think of as a flow chart representing relationships of causal relationships. So we found that fire severity seems to be directly influencing lichen richness by burning up lichens, but it also seems to be indirectly affecting lichen richness by reducing canopy cover and reducing the average height of trees, which may alter the microclimate by removing the cooler, moister conditions that we find under the forest canopy. So in conclusion, high severity fire may drastically reduce lichen diversity for decades. Climate change, the warmer, drier conditions we often are experiencing in California today, may produce harsher conditions in the post-fire landscape where tree cover has been reduced, and may make it even harder for lichens to recolonize. But this isn't all bad news here. There was some really good news that came out of this study. Because we found that thinning these forest stands back to what we think is their historical density is probably not going to harm lichens, and if anything may benefit lichens, because we know that thinning the stands to these historical densities is going to make these stands a lot more resilient to fire. When fire does return, it will probably burn at low severity, and we found that low severity fire is unlikely to harm the lichen communities. So there really is a lot we can do as far as land management to help maintain lichen diversity and maintain resilient forests. So even though the challenges we face with fire may seem a little bit overwhelming, it's totally within our control. We have choices for how we approach this situation. And we can make choices that are going to lead to resilient ecosystems and the maintenance of biodiversity for the foreseeable future. So that's everything I have today. I want to say thanks a lot to Alex and the New York Botanical Garden for inviting me. I'd be happy to take any questions, and I'd also like to invite you to contact me anytime in the future. I'm always happy to hear from people who are interested in chatting about lichens.
Great. Wow. Thank you so much, Jesse. That was fascinating. And it's clear that many people thought so because there are lots of great questions for you. So let's get into some of those. So one question was that asking what other regions or countries are known as global hotspots for lichens outside of California, outside of that US map.
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, I don't think I have a very good answer for you. There can be really diverse lichen communities in some tropical ecosystems. There can be really diverse lichen communities in some high latitude ecosystems like boreal ecosystems, and of course, temperate world as well. I'm not sure. Yeah, so one challenge we have is, unlike with plants, where we have a relatively good understanding of global diversity patterns, that really doesn't exist yet for lichens. We just don't have high resolution spatial distribution data for lichens at a global scale. I think that's one of the great challenges of lichen research in our times, and I think we're going to see great progress on that within the next few decades. There may be information out there that I don't know about that's more recent, but at this time, I can't tell you, where the highest global hotspots are.
Okay, great. Yeah. So related to kind of thinking about lichens on a broader scale, Carol Knox asks, anyone studying these things in the Northeast?
Yes, there are. Well, there's James Lendemer, who's a great lichenologist at NYBG. Yeah, there are a number of great lichenologists in the Northeast. There's a book by Hines and Hines. I think it's called New England Macrolichens. So I think that's the book to get for that part of the world. But yes, there are lichenologists all across the US. There just aren't a lot of us.
Yeah, I believe James Lendemer also recently published a lichen book that I'll post a link in the chat when I get a chance. But I think it's focused on urban lichens.
Yeah, that was James and with Jessie Allen as well, who was formerly at NYBG, and she's now a professor in Washington State. Yeah,
right.
Very, very cool book. Lichens really are everywhere. So even if you live in the city, you can still find some cool lichens. Getting that book would be a great start.
Yes. All right. So another question is is asking basically, how do lichens reseed themselves, or not exactly seed themselves, but how do absent lichens return many decades later? Like, where do the propagules come from?
Yeah, great question. So lichens can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So sexually, they can produce fungal spores that are very, very small and can travel very long distances. In fact, with every breath we take right now, we're probably breathing lichen spores because they're just everywhere in the air. So that can be one, way they can travel long distances to recolonize. But lichens can also reproduce asexually, either through specialized asexual propagules or just through fragmentation of the lichen themselves. So for example, the long fruticose or hair-like lichens that grow in trees may blow apart in storms, and that may actually help disperse them. And so that would be an example of a shorter distance dispersal. They're not going to travel too far through fragmentation. But basically, they're adapted to a whole range of different dispersal strategies. And I'm actually working on a follow-up study right now to try to test what is limiting recolonization after fire. Are the lichens arriving before the environment is ready for them when conditions just aren't right? Or does it take a while for the lichens to even get there? We really don't know for sure, but my guess is the lichens are able to get there pretty quickly.
Great. Yeah, I was curious about that too. And let me take a deep breath of lichen spores and ask this next one. So you mentioned that lichens are especially sensitive to the surrounding environment, and I'm wondering if it's known what makes them so sensitive, or why they react to pollution so much more than maybe some vascular plants do.
Yeah, great question. So one thing that makes lichens especially sensitive is that they don't have roots. So they're not soaking up anything from the soil, which means that they're getting everything they need from the air around them. And so this means they're soaking up everything in the air. And if there's a lot of pollution in the air, it all goes directly into the lichen thallus or lichen body. So plants, in contrast, may have more of a waxy protective layer, as far as they're not necessarily soaking in all the air quite as much. And of course, plants are getting a lot of what they need out of the soil, which is not likely to be as affected by air pollution. So yeah, lichens are just like little sponges soaking up everything that's around them, which makes them quite vulnerable when they're soaking up stuff that's not so good for them.
Yep, that makes sense. Here's another one is, based on your experience in California, especially with the wisdom of the community, what can you tell us about global research or communities of global researchers looking at this same issue, and what lessons might derive from your experience in California? So maybe asking a little bit more about how this could be applicable elsewhere. And it kind of ties into another question Carol Knox has here, is climate change studies in the Northeast, are they going on right now? Cape Cod studies. So as I guess, to put a twist on that, as things warm and cool and change in the next years, and we might expect fires in places where they haven't typically been, even in the Northeast, are there lessons to be learned from California elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's every reason to believe that there would be that our findings in California are likely going to be at least somewhat applicable in many other parts of the world. We know that lichens really are not good at surviving severe fire. So anywhere that's going to experience high severity fire is likely to, see most of the lichens that are present burn up. That's becoming increasingly clear from all the research that's out there. And there have been a few studies on lichens and fire in various parts of the world. And similarly with air pollution, I've been working with a grad student in the Philippines who's doing monitoring lichen communities in response to air pollution. And we expect to see very similar patterns to what's been documented in North America as far as lichen responses to air pollution. So I do think these are really, these patterns are of global significance. Obviously, here in the temperate world, we often have more access to resources to do these studies. So I do think ensuring that more research is able to happen in other parts of the world is one really important goal for global lichen conservation. As far as the Northeast specifically, I don't know of a lot going on in that part of the world, but there has been some interesting work out of the Smoky Mountains by some of those same researchers we mentioned earlier, looking at long-term changes in lichen communities. Some of the most sensitive and rare species seem to be disappearing slowly over time from the Smoky Mountains in the Southern Appalachians. Yeah, there is this idea that we're just gradually losing some of our lichen diversity for many reasons in many different ecosystems. But tracking long-term change in communities is one of the hardest things to do. We often do studies over a timeline of 2 years or 3 years. And so it's much harder to zoom out and think about what's happening at timelines of 20 years or 40 years or 100 years, especially when it gets beyond the length of a human lifetime. But there are resources we can leverage to do this kind of research. And I think it's incredibly important to do that.
Great. Yeah. So I guess here's another one which I'm going to tie two of these questions together. One of the questions is there a bias in lichen diversity because of sampling, just because it's not a charismatic organism like others? And then the other one I'm tying that to is, are there any easy ways to identify common lichens? Like where would someone get started with lichen identification?
Yeah, great questions. Well, first of all, I would say, yeah, there's definitely a bias. Until you've gotten a little bit of experience with lichens, it's really easy to just overlook them entirely. I first got into lichens as an undergrad in college because I took a class on fungi and lichens. And I was amazed. Once I took this class, I realized lichens were everywhere all around me. And in fact, when I walked down the trail through the forest, which I walked almost every day, I realized that I'd been stepping on all these lichens that had fallen from the forest canopy. And it was really just like, how was I not even seeing these lichens before? I mean, I must have been seeing them, but I wasn't really paying attention, didn't know what they were. So it is amazing how much they're all around you once you start looking. So yeah, I do think it's really easy to overlook them. And it is amazing how how abundant they are once you start to notice them. And as far as the other question of how to start identifying them, I mean, there's really no substitute for just getting out in the field with someone with expertise who can point them out to you. So definitely keep an eye out for any lichen classes or workshops you can attend. That's the #1 way to get into it, in my opinion, partly because they're just small and kind of hard to see. And that just kind of, it makes things move faster if you can get some help. But it's also great to get a field guide for your region and just go out and start exploring on your own and see what you can see. And over time, you'll start seeing more and more. You'll start by seeing the biggest, most obvious ones, and then you'll start seeing smaller and smaller ones. There are a number of field guides for different regions of North America. So do a little searching and see what you can find. And then also there are other resources online. Like there are a number of YouTube videos that are, like my colleague, Dr. Ali Weil, who was my lichenology student at UC Davis and is now teaching lichenology at a community college here in the Bay Area. She taught an entire lichenology course on Zoom during the pandemic, and that's all on YouTube now. So you can take Ali's course on YouTube, and that would probably give you some great insights to get started.
Great, thank you. I want to point to there's some chatter happening in the chat and some interesting resources. So someone posted a good book on lichens in northeastern North America. Someone posted an article on the decline of lichens in the Shawangunk Mountains of New York. Douglas Daly was commenting that it takes an army to do a really thorough inventory of lichens in an area. And Dorothy Smolin comments that the New Jersey Mycological Association is running 2 lichen trips this spring at both ends of the state. So that might be a way for people interested to go get directly involved. I think we're at noon now. I think it's a little earlier Jesse's time, but I really want to appreciate Jesse for talking with us and sharing his research, and thank everyone else for being with us today. I think your Twitter handle is a lichen genus. So if you want to keep following what Jesse's up to, you can follow him there and see his work as it comes out. And if you missed any of the presentation or want to watch it again or share it, there's going to be a recording posted on the NYBG website. So also, please stay tuned for more science seminars in the future. We've got some great ones coming up, and thank you again.
All right, thanks a lot for having me. Really appreciate it, and feel free to drop me a line if anyone wants to chat about lichens more.
Thanks, Jesse.
All right, goodbye, everyone.